right, my name is Taniyahh Lennon, and my topic is culturally competent or culturally flown knowledge on deaf culture. How do you move the picture? All right, so we'll be going over a literature review, research results, discussion, future studies, and at the end, I will take some questions. Okay, so why this subject? So subjects pertaining to people who are deaf is under research. People who are deaf deserve equal access to healthcare and mental health treatment. People who are deaf deserve to be treated with respect and dignity from criminal justice workers. People who are deaf deserve fair treatment while incarcerated and also during criminal proceedings. So to understand this PowerPoint, we're gonna go over some terminology first so y'all do not get lost in the process. So to be deaf with a capital D means to be part of a community with their culture and to share language. And deaf with a lowercase d means that you cannot hear. And latent deaf means that you are able to acquire spoken language, but later in life became deaf. And hard of hearing is you can hear some, so maybe you use a cochlear implant and you can hear some, but you can't fully hear 100%. And deaf plus means that you're deaf plus another disability, like being deaf plus being autistic, being deaf and having Down syndrome, being deaf and having cerebral palsy. And deaf blind means that you're deaf and blind at the same time. And then autism is the notion that people feel like deaf people are inferior to hearing people for the simple fact that they can't hear and they can't understand or do spoken language. And the oral method is when deaf people were not allowed to use sign language and they were taught to like feel vocal cord vibrations, lip reading, and basically to understand spoken word and also maybe eventually be able to speak. All right. So now we will go a little bit into deaf history. So it was said that hearing is linked to learning. So if deaf people could not hear, they could not learn, and that's where you get derogatory terms like deaf and mute or deaf and dumb, because they think if they couldn't hear, they could not acquire knowledge. And so in the Milan Conference in 1880, sign language was actually banned. So they were not allowed to use sign language in any like educational settings. They were punished if they tried to use sign language. And this really pushed the notion of autism that you are superior because you can hear and that you can speak. And this really pushed the oral method too, which is basically filling vocal cord vibrations, lip reading, and not using sign language, because why sign when it's not a good way to acquire knowledge? That's what's there. So, but lip reading, only 30% of speech is found on your lips. So lip reading is not effective. It's not an effective form of communication because only 30% of the conversation can get by lip reading. And because of the sign language being banned, autism, and the oral method, about 30% of the deaf population to this day have a reading level below the third grade. But eventually things start to get a little bit better and deaf schools starting to pop up. But there's still not many deaf schools in the US. And the oral method is still pushed because 9% of deaf people are born to hearing parents. So they're more so thinking, I need to get my kid to be able to be more like hearing people. So I want to teach them how to understand spoken word instead of giving them this early access to sign language or whatever form of communication they need. So now we will dive into a little bit about deaf culture, because to understand a group of people, you need to understand their culture. So like I said, capital D deaf means that you take pride in being deaf, you use the language and stuff like that. And lowercase d deaf means that you can't hear, but you do not associate or with the deaf community. So you rather be integrated more so in the hearing society. And the deaf community as a whole is a more collectivist culture. And also within the deaf community, you have micro groups, just like any other culture. So you have deaf people who are blind, you have deaf people who use nonverbal signs because they might be deaf plus and have autism and stuff like that. And also you have like BASL, which is Black American Sign Language. So Black people sign in the deaf community sign different than maybe the white counterparts. So you have like Native American Sign Language and all that type of stuff. And there's also different languages like tactile signing, which is used by people who are deaf blind. So that's more so you're signing, but you're touching a person's hands because they can't see, but they can feel. And then you have sign exact English, and that's basically sign language that's in the syntax of English, because sign ASL and English has different syntax. And most times, sign exact English used for people who are late and deaf who have already acquired this spoken language. So they're used to the English syntax, so they use sign exact English. And there is nonverbal signs for people who have like autism and Down syndrome. And also you have to remember that sign language is actually a very expressive language. It's like if they're telling a story where they were upset, sad, scared, you're going to see that in their body language and facial expression. It doesn't mean that in the current moment they are feeling that way. It's just how they express themselves. And then about 40% of deaf children have a learning disability. All right, so now that we learned a bit about deaf culture and deaf history, we're going to see how deaf people are victimized by the criminal justice system. All right, so we start off with Joseph Hurd. So he spent 22 months, about 2 years, in a Washington, D.C. jail illegally. Since they did not provide him any way for him to communicate, he could not tell anyone that he was being held unlawfully. They did not say what happened with his outcome, but he did eventually get released. Then you have Richard and Joanne Bell. So on June 30th, 2000, in Austin, Texas, Richard Bell, who is deafblind, and his wife, Joanne Bell, who is deaf, had a dispute over a lack of braille in a restaurant manager. The manager knocked Richard, the deafblind guy, out of his seat, and they called the police. And when the officer arrived, an interpreter was not provided, even though it was stated that one is needed. The officer continued to speak to the deaf individuals who cannot hear. He continued to speak to them. And a lawsuit was filed on their behalf by the Texas Civil Rights Project. Once the lawsuit was settled, officers working in Austin, Texas, had to undergo at least 4 hours of training dealing with individuals with disability, including those who are deaf and blind. Then you have Dan Tesson. So in 2006, Dan Tesson was shot with beanbags by the Mosquito PD in California. He was mistakenly identified and was not given a chance to explain he was deaf and could not hear. And the police department had to pay him $40,000. Esther Valdez. In 2009 in Austin, Texas, she was ordered to stop walking down a busy street. Since she was deaf but could not hear the officer demand, she was arrested for resisting arrest for commands that she could not hear. So the charges were eventually dropped, and the PD only paid her $500 plus her legal fees. And John T. Williams. In 2010, John T. Williams was shot to death by the Seattle PD in Washington. He was shot multiple times in his back and side for not turning around and facing the officer that he could not hear the commands. So no interpreter was provided at all. The shooting was not justified. The officer resigned, and the family of John T. Williams was paid $1.5 million. And Doug Bow. In 2013, Doug Bow was beaten by the St. Paul PD in Minnesota for trying to use pen and paper to communicate. And Doug Bow won a lawsuit of $20,000 in damages and $73,000 in legal fees. The St. Paul PD in Minnesota was retrained due to this incident. And this was an anonymous submission. So in Pasco County in 2013, 3 police officers restrained a deaf person for trying to use pen and paper to request an ASL interpreter. They refused all ways to communicate effectively with the person. The deaf person was unable to find legal counsel, so nothing happened with the case. Then you have David Uppike. In 2013, the Grinsham and Montemah County PD in Oregon, a public defender requested an ASL interpreter in court, and the judge laughed at him. But eventually, 3 days later, he was given an interpreter, and the charges were dropped, and the lawsuit is still currently pending. Tiana Ingram. So in 2013, Tiana Ingram was in a car accident. She was scared of the driver in the other car, so she grabbed a metal pipe in her car, but did not attempt to swing or hit the other driver with the pipe. She said the cops wrongfully arrested her and denied her an interpreter. She won a lawsuit of $80,000 in December of 2016. So a lot of this stuff is kind of like recent. This is not old stuff. And Opal Gordon. So in 2015, Opal Gordon was arrested by the NYPD after leaving court in 2015. She was arrested for violating a protection order. The police did not explain to her why she was being arrested and did not read her Miranda rights. She was kept in jail overnight and repeatedly denied an ASL interpreter. It took 21 hours to get her an interpreter, and in 2007, she won a $100,000 lawsuit for being jailed overnight and denied an interpreter. Stephen Fowles. So in 2008, Stephen Fowles' house was burglarized, and he was He called Anne Arundel County PD in Maryland for help and was tackled to the ground. He tried to give the officer a note and was tackled to the ground. That's why he was tackled. And a lawsuit was filed and settled, but they didn't say how much. So even like crime, deputies who called police for help are getting victimized. Then you have Diana and Chris Williams. In 2011, Diana and Chris Williams was trying to evict tenants from a building in Staten Island. One of the tenants signaled they had a gun, so Chris called the police via video relay system, which notifies police need to bring an ASL interpreter because the person is deaf. But the NYPD showed up without one. The hearing tenants were able to tell their side of the story to the police. The deaf defendants in the building offered to translate for the Williams, but the police declined. So even they had somebody willing to help with the communication, but the police still said no. So since only the hearing side, the hearing tenants story was told to police, they ended up arresting the Williams, and a lawsuit was settled for $750,000 for wrongful arrest. So Philip Wolf. So in 2012, Philip Wolf was called the Portland PD in Washington for a domestic violence dispute. Philip Wolf requested an ASL interpreter, but one was not given. The officer could not establish effective communication, so they left in the middle of a domestic violence dispute. And Philip Wolf was attacked again for a second time. Once the police officer left, the city of Portland had to pay about $51,000 for violating the ADA and not providing communication access. So even deaf people that are calling because they are being beat on by their partner or not treated well. And then you have LaShawn White. In 2012, LaShawn White called 911 operating system via video relay, which notifies that they need an interpreter for protection from an abusive partner. The Tacoma PD in Washington responded. When the police arrived, she ran towards them for protection. They tased, beat, and arrested her for ignoring verbal commands that she could not hear. The officers were even informed that she was deaf by the neighbors, and even the 911 dispatcher told them that she was deaf, but still they came with verbal commands. And charges were dropped, but she did not actually win a lawsuit. So yeah, so all these deaf people are being victimized by police officers, even when they need help, even when they're calling, they're being told that they're deaf, that they need to supply an interpreter, or they're trying to write back and forth and they're still being denied. So now we will go into more so what accessibility needs to look like for deaf people. So we're going to accessibility during arrest and interrogation. So during arrest, the suspect is informed of their rights and the injustice starts there. Miranda warning during arrest informs the person of their rights to remain silent and to be appointed a lawyer. Even though the law requires a qualified ASL interpreter to give the Miranda warning or evidence for the interrogation to be thrown out, it still does not establish full understanding, because you can't just assume you come in contact with a deaf person that they need an ASL interpreter. There's different forms of communication. Some might use sign exact English, so an ASL interpreter is not going to cut it. Or they might be nonverbal, so they're using more so home signs, or they're having specific staff that knows their nonverbal signs. So it's always best to ask the person, well, how do you want to communicate, instead of assuming. That's the simplest way is to ask instead of assuming. And literacy rates in the deaf community show that roughly 30% of deaf individuals read below about a third grade reading level. And the Miranda warning requires a 7th through 8th grade reading level, and it's difficult to translate from English to ASL. So even with the Miranda warning as a whole, it's hard to translate to a deaf person. But even if you have a qualified interpreter, they need to be qualified on legal jargon, because how are you going to explain to somebody what's going on if you don't even understand the legal jargon yourself? So when deaf suspects are given a Miranda warning, 60% cannot understand what is actually being relayed to them. And once the person, if they get effective communication in, maybe they can move on to trial. Now it comes into play that you need to assess their fitness to stand trial. And that right there can be difficult in itself, but it doesn't mean you should not do it. So when you're assessing a deaf person fitness to stand trial, you need to assess their mental level and also their linguistic level. Because a deaf person can be mentally competent to stand trial, but be linguistically unable to stand trial due to the communication barrier. But with that being said, deafness is not above the law. So just because you might not feel like establishing that communication, that doesn't give you a right, if they did do something wrong, just to let them go free. So you should be taking this time to actually figure out if they assessing them correctly. Because just because you're deaf doesn't mean you should get off on crimes, because people don't want to sit down and take the time to actually assess your mental and linguistic levels. And when your mental health professional is assessing a deaf person, that you're going to most likely have an interpreter present, whether it's somebody with nonverbal, a deaf blind interpreter, an ASL, you're going to have an interpreter. So you need a larger time allocation. So it's not going to take, because you got to have the interpreter translating between the two. So you want to have a large time allocation to make sure everything is being relayed, because the person is trying to interpret while you're also talking. So you need to slow down, because when you're dealing with this, you're playing with somebody's life. Like, they're either going to go free, they're going to go to prison. If they got a capital offense, they can be facing death. So this is serious, because you're really playing with people's lives. And also, like I said, you need to ask the client what is their preferred method of communication. A lot of people like to jump to, we can write back and forth. Well, ASL and English have different syntax. So maybe they don't understand English syntax, so that's not going to work. And like I said, a qualified interpreter must understand the legal jargon. There's no point of having an interpreter that can't really explain what's going on. So once a deaf person may be found competent to stand trial mentally and linguistically, you have to talk about accessibility on the courtroom. So just like when you're assessing fitness to stand trial in a courtroom, you need a larger time allocation, because the process is going to take longer, but doesn't mean you should just not do it or just have them cop out for a plea deal. You should actually make time for this. So, because you're trying to you got the judges, you got the lawyers, prosecution, defense. So everybody's talking. So you need to slow down so the interpreter has time to relay the information to the suspect or the defendant. And also, it's really important for everybody in the courtroom at that time to understand deaf culture. So maybe you need an expert witness that can go on stand and testify about deaf culture, because you need to understand that it's an expressive language. So if somebody's in court and that person is testifying, they might show that how they felt during something. They might have felt angry, so they're on stand being very expressive and showing their anger at that time, but that doesn't mean they're currently angry, so you shouldn't say they're acting erratic in court. Also, they might be on stand and they might be showing that they're sad, and doesn't mean that they're not competent to be on stand. They're just expressing how they felt at that moment, but that might not be their current state of emotion. And it's also important to understand the role of the interpreter, because when it's having an interpreter, it's easy to talk to the interpreter, but you're supposed to talk to the person. The interpreter is not there to speak for the person, so you shouldn't be asking questions to the interpreter on the person's behalf. You speak to the person, you ask the questions to them, and you get their response, not the interpreter. The interpreter is just there to relay the communication barrier. All right, so now we will jump into my research. So my empirical question: does knowledge on deaf culture differ amongst criminal justice students and the general public? And does knowledge on deaf culture differ amongst gender? So my hypothesis is that criminal justice majors will have more knowledge on deaf culture than the general public, but overall participants will score low on the knowledge set, despite what category you're in. So my methods: so participants will consent to complete a 35-item questionnaire that will assess their knowledge on deaf culture. The survey will be scored on a grading scale of 0 to 35 points, and participants were divided by male, female, male general population, female general population, male criminal justice students, and female criminal justice students. Independent variable: gender, CJ student, and general population. Independent variable: knowledge test scores. So this was my female criminal justice majors versus male criminal justice majors. So it was significant, and it showed that female criminal justice majors have more knowledge than male criminal justice majors. And all this was done with t-tests. And then this is female general population versus male general population. This was not significant, so there was nothing found there. And this was female as a whole and males as a whole. And this was significant, showing that females have more knowledge on deaf culture than males. And I did CJ majors versus general population. This was not significant. So there was no big difference between criminal justice majors and the general public. And this was my mean scores. And this just shows that female criminal justice majors scored the highest at all groups on the knowledge test. and female general population scored higher. And this also shows that no matter what category females ran, that they scored higher. And surprisingly, the male criminal justice major actually scored lower than the male general population. And I did female criminal justice majors versus female general public. And this just shows that female criminal justice majors had a higher mean score than a female general public. And the male criminal justice major versus male general public just shows that the male general public had a higher mean score than male criminal justice majors. And like I said, my hypothesis is that everybody will score low, and the median score was 18. So that's about like a 51% on a test. Yes. Yep. Mostly everybody got Fs. Yeah. So the conclusion was that females tend to have more knowledge. Even though they have more knowledge, everybody mean scores were low. There was only 2 people that actually, I mean, they got better scores, but they still wasn't good. But yeah, we had 2 people that got better scores, and the lowest score was a 7. The highest score was a 28.
What's a 7 equal to?
7 out of 35? Low.
Very well.
And nothing was significant between the general public and criminal justice majors. So no matter if you're in school and you plan on working in the law, you really have to show they have no more knowledge than the general public. And then for future studies, I would say give the knowledge test to criminal justice workers to maybe see, are they getting some on-job training? And I would say compare places that actually have training on deaf culture to places that does not. To see, even if you have training, is it effective? If it's not effective, then you need to redo it.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So I assume you say they are different, and you didn't show the p-value. I assume they are significant difference, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And how about when you say for all the group, like female CJ, female general population male, and then all those 4 groups, are they significant different, or you just look at the mean score? Are you testing?
Oh, I was just looking at the mean scores.
So you didn't test?
Well, you did test it on the.
I think you should.
Yeah, this one.
Are you talking about this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't test, but I did have like subdivisions with everything.
Yeah, but you test, you look at mean score, but you say you didn't test them?
I just did the mean scores.
Okay, you should. If you use ANOVA, you can find are they really significant difference.
Okay.
That'd be more persuadable, because sometimes we look at mean score, they can be different, but until the statistics show, yeah.
However, for Fang-Mei, it is all a race to the bottom. They all failed.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody.
Some might have failed less than others.
Yeah, this was like the scores. That's all the scores. So yeah, most everybody failed.
Regression to see how far off.
Like,
Which shift?
do you have anything at Bowling Green Police Department and training at all?
No.
I know, nobody does. I was just asking.
They don't even have TTY phones.
Oh wow. Down bad.
Yeah.
Well, and you know, as they were talking about those cases, it didn't seem like a lot of money to what they went.
Yeah.
The one that I guess upset me was the attorney got basically 4 times as much as the guy who actually.
Oh, the $500 one?
No, the one like he got 20K and the attorney.
Oh yeah.
Got 73,000.
Yeah.
Really bad.
And you know,
That was only some of them. I had a whole I think I had like 100 different ones, but only chose a couple. I had 100 different people, deaf people that had been victimized, but only chose a couple of them.
and I've seen firsthand interpreters, just like you talked about, that didn't convey either what the deaf person was saying correctly to the judge, or didn't convey what the judge was saying correctly to the deaf person.
Yeah.
How approximately in the United States, how many, is there an organization for attorneys that, can interpret or whatever?
I don't think there's any organization. Only place is that helps with like deaf people with the law is HERD. They're literally the only place, pretty sure in the world, heard, help and advocate and advance the rights of the deaf. They're located in DC. I think they're the only organization literally in the world that does that. And they keep track of like deaf inmates and make sure they're being treated right. And they help them like find counsel if they do need to sue. They're the only organization, literally.
It's such a deficit.
Mm-hmm.
What gets you interested in this topic?
Well, when I was an undergrad, I wanted to learn about a different culture, so I just picked this one. And it's just at random. Yeah. I was like, I want to learn about something different, so I just picked the deaf culture. So, guess I'm still here with it.
Anybody have any questions about this? Shocking study? Shocking and shameful. It is, I mean, it's true for a lot of disciplines. That's like the last appropriate way to discriminate according to criminal justice.
Is there lots of Disney?
Is there what?
Lots of Disney?
I think there are also Disney, right? Anybody else Disney? Lots of Disney.
Yeah. Any of these things, you get more training on, do it. So, Sarah has an ASL program.
I know Owens does.
So, yeah, the same guy. teaches
Same
all-
guy who's above him?
Yeah. And I know him personally. I was gonna say, we call him, but he's deaf as well.
So you need to interpret.
Like your entire slide, I was thinking of it, all of it, because same thing. He was born to hearing parents. They kind of treated him like, excuse my language, but shit his whole life. Didn't give him anything extra. He basically learned everything on his own. He can read lips very, very well, and he can talk as well. But yeah, he teaches all of them around here. So if you go by his class, they're like, you have to learn quickly because it's all science. So
Yeah.
Yeah, we had some deaf students here, and it was a real struggle to teach them directly. A real struggle. Not too much for them. It was more like getting the help they needed, getting the translators, all of that stuff.
I'm surprised they didn't bring up any examples of like the government examples when they have a translator and they can call out because they don't know Excel at all.
Right. They
Right,
do.
there were some
They do
cases
that.
where they were on TV and they were just fraudulent. They were just up there doing anything.
Yeah.
Like, so the reason I know what you say is.
Yeah, that's what they do, man.
May you have any other questions?
Yeah, so just curiosity, when they go to the court and they need an interpreter, who pay for the interpreter fee?
Interpreter fee?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but you would hope the court would pay.
Supposed to.
I would say they
Yeah,
the court.
so you don't know for sure.
Nope.
Yeah, because I know now it's in medical field, if they need an interpreter, for people from different culture, the hospital have to pay. So I hope the court do the same thing.
I know at different universities, like I remember talking with a student a long time ago, not even the same people over here, and they did not want to pay for any accommodation. Well, I have a line student too, not want to pay for like a note taker or anything like that. And they said, no, that's too expensive, not to do it. I said, well, you gotta do it. Oh, good, it's fine. But yeah, you believe they said that? Look, he and his dad were sitting right there. Same time.
Yeah, I know at Kent State they only pay for interpreter for the first class, and then you got to figure it out for the rest of the class.
No, it's not the law.
Right, that's what they did.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's what they did. Because when I took a deaf culture class, we actually had a deaf person in there, and she was saying how she only gets interpreted for the first class, and she has to figure out. And she never came back to class after that. So I'm guessing she probably dropped out because she couldn't afford it.
I really like your topic. I think it's very special because now many people, aware about this issue. So
Yeah.
proud of you. I like this topic.
I had a student in a research class, he had autism,
Mhm.
and he went to see the difference between police departments. And none of them had programs, right? And so he used Fremont Police Department, and after he did that, they mandated training. I think it was at Fremont.
Yeah. I know one of my clients, because I work with people with autism, some police officers were sitting down and eating. He's going to go up to him and was like, I'm scared of y'all, got to be careful because y'all kill people. I was like, come on, let's go. I was like, come on before you really get in trouble. Yeah, he was like, I'm scared of y'all because y'all kill people. and he was acting all erratic, and I was like, come on before you really get arrested.
Yeah. Don't stand next to him.
And I was like, come on, come by me.
It really is a deficit for police and anyone who's with them, you know, whatever different means, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's a different sort of victimology that you guys are sitting here, but very important.
Yeah.
Good job.